Good evening and welcome to the special Election 2022 edition of Arizona Horizon. I'm Ted Simons. Tonight, it's a debate between candidates for Arizona's Secretary of State. Tonight's debate is sponsored by Arizona Clean Elections, your source for nonpartisan official election information.
I'm Richard Rellis of the Arizona Republic and azcentral.com. Tonight's debate is not a formal exercise. It's an open exchange of ideas, an opportunity for give and take between the candidates for one of the state's highest offices. Dialogue between candidates is encouraged and given the candidates perhaps inevitable, provided that all sides get a fair shake, and we'll do our best to make sure that happens.
And joining us now for tonight's debate, Republican Mark Finchem, a member of Arizona's House of Representatives, and Democrat Adrian Fontes, a former Maricopa County recorder. Candidates will give opening statements in a randomly selected order and will give closing statements in the opposite order. We start with Mark Finchem.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you tonight. I'm running for Secretary of State to restore honor, to restore integrity, to restore security to the Secretary of State's office. All I'm asking is one thing, that whether you're a candidate, a party official, an elections official, or a supporter, just follow the law. It's not up to the Secretary of State to try and make law. It's up to the Secretary of State to enforce the law that has already been laid down by the state legislature.
All right. Thank you, sir.
And now we turn to Adrian Fontes.
Thank you, Ted. Richard. My name is Adrian Fontes. Thank you so much. If the last 6 years have taught us anything, it is that democracy is a decision. Tonight we'll talk about that decision. A decision between building community or conspiracies that lead to corruption and chaos. A decision between laws and lies. Democracy is a decision between voting and violence. I am Adrian Fontes. I'm a United States Marine Corps veteran, former prosecutor, and Maricopa County recorder. Most importantly, I'm an Arizona native and a father to 3 young women. And they deserve the freedom to make their own choices, to make their own decisions. Tonight we'll talk about their choices and decisions on how they can vote and how our democracy can survive. Thank you.
All right, gentlemen, thank you very much. Mark, we'll start with you. Arizona voters want to know, you've been very critical of the 2020 election results. Would you, as Secretary of State, have signed off on those results?
There are too many hypotheticals to really answer that question because we didn't know what we knew after the election until after the certification of the canvass occurred. But knowing what we know today, there are certain counties that should have been set aside as irredeemably compromised. Maricopa County was one of them. Yuma County was one of them. We have so many votes outside of the law that it begs the question, what do we do with an election where we have votes that are in the stream but should not be counted? If you can't find the individual who is engaged in that behavior, perhaps that county has had a defective election.
How are these votes irredeemable? How are these votes outside the law?
Well, we have, for example, in Yuma County, ballot harvesting and votes. I mean, we've got people who were indicted for the very thing that we're talking about right now, who pled guilty. And frankly, those votes altered the outcome of Yuma County. So how did they get counted? How do the people who were disenfranchised through nullification, how do we help them?
Was that enough, what he just mentioned, as far as Yuma County and Maricopa County in general? That's your beat, that you're involved with that. Is that enough to have not certified the election?
I think what we have to look at here is the common value that we share, and that is that we have to have faith in our democracy. And our democracy really rests on the decisions that thousands of people make, Republicans and Democrats alike, who did the work of elections. When we have conspiracy theories and lies like the ones Mr. Finchem has just shared, based in no real evidence, what we end up doing is eroding the faith that we have in each other as citizens. I was talking to someone last night who said, and she's a Democrat, she said, I just want to be friends with my Republican neighbors again. The kind of divisiveness, not based in fact, not based in any evidence, that we've seen trumpeted by Mr. Finchem is dangerous for America, and we have to call it what it is.
I take exception to what he's just said.
Please
He
explain.
basically is running over the evidence that has been presented, the evidence that is visual evidence. You can't go back and relitigate something that has been recorded on video.
What has been recorded on video? What evidence
You
do
have
you
people taking ballots, harvesting ballots, stuffing them into ballot collection boxes that are unsupervised.
Are you talking about the 2000 Mules movie? Just
Exactly.
Okay.
That is one example. So there is a plethora of evidence. If you want to go find it, open.ink. You can look at 3 terabytes of information that speaks to not just video, but documentation. If it were not so, how would we have individuals who were indicted, pled guilty, and are now turning on the very people that engaged in the same behavior? That is not something, as Mr. Fontes would say, that is not something that's fiction. That is fact. It is in court.
Well, a lot of it is not in court. A lot of this evidence is not admissible evidence in court.
That is not true, sir. It's been in court. It is the court record in the Yuma County Superior Court.
How many
and you're trying to tell me that that's not admissible?
How many 2000 Mules claims have made it to court?
You've got 3 people who have pled guilty to their indictments. That's at least, you're trying to say that there's no evidence?
Well, I'm trying to
you-
figure out if their evidence is enough to overturn an election and not certify the results.
I'm not talking about overturning an election. I'm talking about declaring one county's election as irredeemably compromised. Now, if that alters the outcome of the election, that's a different story. I'm talking about the fact that if an election is mismanaged, what redress do the people have for that mismanagement and malfeasance?
So the answer to that question is the rule of law and the Constitution. There are processes and procedures. There are court filings that can be made and do often get made in Arizona when there are questions about the outcomes of races. And those challenges happened in court if they were appropriate at the time. And Mr. Finchem mentioned the certification of not only Maricopa, but the other 14 counties in Arizona as well. That certification went through each of the boards of supervisors to the Secretary of State and ultimately to the governor's office. What we now have is an entire set of fiction that has somehow managed to make a lot of money for some people outside of the regular norms that we expect. This is a chaotic way of readdressing a political loss, if you will. And in America, the business of America is business. We need stability and predictability in our elected offices and our elected officials. We can't have wild-eyed skepticism just trying to figure out what things were if they got upset with the result. But the point here is this. The process has already existed. They went through, and it's time to move away from 2020.
I'd like to address that.
Absolutely. And then I have a follow-up for you.
So, September 13th, 2020, Republic's, your paper, Abe Kwok. Adrian Fontes had some dramatically bad moments. In fact, he was recklessly irresponsible and deserving the boot. That's why he was not elected. In fact, he was kicked out of office and replaced with Adrian Fontes. But yet, we have Lori Roberts said Fontes is making up election law as he goes along.
This is about the sending of...
This is about the 2020 election.
This is about sending this is about sending ballots out to every registered voter. We were going to ask you about
It's
that.
even more than that.
I think what's
Allow me
important
to
here-
finish, please.
Let him finish.
Sure.
Lori Roberts said Fontes is making up election law as he goes along. This won't end well. In fact, a frightening thought that the guy in charge of elections can do as he pleases as long as there's no prohibition in the law. Now, he's just said we have plenty of laws and we need to build confidence. I could not agree more. We need to build confidence. But we need to have a senior elections director who will just follow the law instead of making it up as he goes. And that's what we've had here.
Well, I would ask Mr. Finchem to revise that statement based on his presence at the violent insurrection in January 6th that resulted in the deaths of police officers. What we saw was an angry mob that didn't like the outcome of one election, and so instead of going through the process and procedure that he would normally say would apply, what he did was engage in a violent insurrection and try to overturn the very Constitution that holds this nation together.
Once again,
He is
I am
a
going
part
to
of an
challenge.
If I can finish
Let him
this
finish,
time.
please.
Thank you. He is part of an organization that has called for the violent overthrow of our government. He has supporters, and he himself has called for a civil war in this country, the stockpiling of ammunition for this very war. It is a unhinged and violent aspect of Mr. Finchem that he'd rather not discuss, going to some technical differences that we may have had. And the point of March 2020, if I could, is this. At the outset of a global pandemic, when only Democrats were eligible to vote, and people were afraid to leave their homes because they might die, my opportunity to send folks ballots was the one that was on the side of the voters, not on the side of some made-up prohibition, which frankly did not exist at the time.
We'll get you to
Mr.
respond.
Fontes is just engaged in total fiction.
What did you expect to happen on January 6th?
Mr. Fontes is just engaged in total fiction, the creation of something that did not exist. I was interviewed by the DOJ and the J6 Commission as a witness. I'm not the one with a criminal record, he is. I've investigated crimes all my life. I have prevented fraud most of my life. So for him to assert that I was part of a criminal uprising is absurd, and frankly, it is a lie.
What did you expect to happen on January 6th? You had a book of evidence?
I had a book of evidence.
What was in the book of evidence?
It was information that was gathered during November 30th, the 10.5-hour hearing that we had, an ad hoc hearing on public integrity, on integrity of the election. It was turned over as probable cause to the Senate. 14 days later, they issued subpoenas. Those very subpoenas, we are still looking at some of the evidence that's been gathered. Here's a prime example. Over 140,000 ballot images don't have an audit head stamp. How did that happen? If Dominion equipment is supposed to be uniform in its application of the scanning and tabulation of ballots.
How does it happen that election officials, county, statewide, hear these claims, hear these accusations, they've done audits before, during, and after elections, and they find no evidence of wrongdoing and no evidence of widespread fraud? How does that happen?
So we've got the evidence.
Well,
the media has just refused to look at it.
No, the media was. Why are the courts not?
Allow me to finish, sir.
Allow me to ask
We
the
have
question.
140,000 ballot images out of Maricopa County that were allegedly scanned by Dominion equipment that have no audit head stamp.
Is that a,
How did that happen?
Is that a criminal activity?
I'm asking questions here, sir. I've spent 8 years in the Arizona legislature. I was elected to do one thing: ask questions on behalf of my constituents. I now have an open question that cannot be answered. We've gone to court, and the allegation is, well, the case was thrown out of court. No, the case was not. It was dismissed on standing. We are now in front of the Ninth Circuit because the standing question was misapplied. We have presented the evidence, and the court accepted the evidence. So to make the allegation that there's no evidence is patently false.
It's been. Go ahead, please, Richard.
To move slightly on from 2020, was the August midterm election fair? Were there any improprieties you saw?
I have no idea. It is what it is.
What changed?
What changed?
Yes.
The candidates. I have no idea. We've not really dug into what happened with the processing of ballots. I think that there has been certainly a heightened sense of scrutiny.
But
people have taken a closer look.
The
machines are the same. I mean, we
I'd
have
like to have a
spotted
little
the
input
same,
in
a
this
similar
conversation.
algorithm.
Okay,
Yeah.
let's get a response.
Thank
here.
you. I think what we just heard is the most telling piece of information here. When you asked what changed, he said the candidates. Not the process, not the people running things, not the rules, generally speaking, but the candidates. And we know from what he said in Time magazine, he asserts that the only reason that he still believes Donald Trump won 2020 was because he doesn't know anyone who voted for Joe Biden. Here's the bottom line. All of what Mr. Finchem is talking about is politically motivated. And it's that kind of instability, it's that kind of unpredictability that Arizona and its sound government and the people who are vested in the interest of making sure that we can have predictability in these things for the purposes of business and law and medicine. All of the schools that have their budgeting cycles, every little bit of our society is run by this idea of a constant election cycle. Elections are the golden thread that run through the fabric of our society. And if you pull that out with this unpredictable, chaotic way of looking at things based on the candidates, the entire fabric disintegrates, and we can't afford that kind of unpredictability. Doing it right is what we did. And it's not our fault that he can't accept one loss.
I'd like to speak to predictability, okay? August primaries 2018, over 60, as a matter of fact, 63 precincts experienced significant issues and were not able to open on time. In fact, people stood in line for hours. You want to talk about predictability? We are looking at an individual who was given the boot. He was fired by the taxpayers, fired by the voters because of incompetence, misfeasance, malfeasance, the inability to hold an election in a predictable manner. Going to the polls should be open when they're supposed to be open. They should have ink in the print-on-demand printers. You should have poll workers who are prepared to do their job. Yet Mr. Fontes was unable to do that in a county election. How does that manifest itself in a statewide supervisory role? He just brought up the point. We have 15 counties that hold individual elections. If you can't handle one county, how are you going to handle 15?
To your lawsuit, which the federal judge has said it should be a state issue, not necessarily a federal issue. That was one of the issues. What role do you see the federal government having? I mean, you're running for a job to write a procedural manual for how elections are conducted. What role does the federal government have in Arizona's elections?
I think the federal government needs to butt out of states' rights.
But you're asking,
it is the legislature who names the time, place, and manner of an election, not the federal government. In fact, it's interesting that H.R. 1, we hear from the Democrats, quite frankly, that everything was perfect, everything was fine. Yet they want to run H.R. 1 through Congress. And when that fails, because Democrats wouldn't vote for it, then they try to bring it into Arizona and force it through as a citizens' initiative.
I think Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution of the United States of America would disagree with Mr. Finchem's assertion about who is charged with the time, place, and manner of elections. Clearly, Congress plays a significant role, and that happens to be the federal government, for your information, sir. But the reality here is this. The Secretary of State's office is far more than just rehashing old issues. It's about making sure that every Arizona voter, for example, has the choice of how they want to vote. Mr. Finchem wants to strip Arizona citizens of their capacity to vote by mail. This is not just an honored tradition in this great state, but it was created by his party decades ago. It is a secure, accountable, and economical system, far better for so many voters than having to go stand in long lines in person. He just complained about long lines. Well, guess what? The only line you have to stand in is the one outside in your mailbox when you're voting by mail. He wants to destroy that, but moreover, he wants to take freedoms away. He wants to take away our choice for who is our U.S. Senator, introducing a bill that would take the selection of U.S. Senators away from the people and put it in the hands of the legislature. He got on a bill that would do the exact same thing for president. In other words, Mr. Finchem, for all his bluster, doesn't want you to vote for these offices. He doesn't want you to vote for anything or in any way other than what he prescribes. That's dangerous.
That's an interesting perspective. First of all, Mr. Fontes apparently doesn't appreciate the difference, the separation of powers. The Secretary of State does nothing for policy. That is up to the legislature. The Secretary of State doesn't eliminate people's ability to vote. That's up to the legislature. If they want to alter the law, the job of the executive.
But you've called for that. You've called for the elimination.
Sir.
You've called for the elimination of vote by mail.
Are we not going to have a separated debate here? This is a man who supports national popular vote, supports ranked choice voting, supports people who are willing to do an assault on the state capitol at the very time that we are trying to pass a budget.
Do you or do you not want to kill vote by mail in Arizona?
I am not interested in litigating the idea that the legislature
hold on,
doesn't
gentlemen, hold on. The question is mail-in voting. Do you want to get rid of mail-in voting?
What I want doesn't matter. What I'm telling you is that
it does matter to your mindset and your judgment. Is mail-in voting a good thing for Arizona?
My mindset and judgment doesn't matter in this regard.
You're not
could
answering
answer
the
the
What I'm
question.
telling you is it's not up to the Secretary of State to write law. And that is exactly what the current Secretary of State and Mr. Fontes have tried to do.
So you're not going to answer the question of whether or not you approve of mail-in voting?
I don't care for mail-in voting. That's
Okay.
why I go to the polls.
That's what we wanted to hear.
And he has stated that he wants it eliminated in Arizona.
But
he wants
to
all
that
voters.
point, sir,
Please, if you
what I
don't want me
want
interrupting
does
you,
not
Mark,
matter.
Mark, if you don't want me interrupting you, then don't interrupt me.
Well, then stop it.
Thanks. He doesn't want you to vote by mail. He wants you to only vote on Election Day at an assigned precinct place after standing in line only. What if you're one of Arizona's hundreds of thousands of older voters or a disabled veteran? Or you live in a remote
This
community.
is a false choice.
This is the choice that you present.
This is a false
Okay,
choice.
let him respond, please.
This is a false choice. I support absentee votes. In fact, one of the best absentee vote programs in the country is Tennessee. You opt in instead of sending 200,000 ballots to people that didn't request them. And by the way, you were told by the court that that was illegal and you couldn't do it.
That's not the court
The
said.
fact of
Mark,
the matter
you know
is,
better.
I support absentee ballot voting. I do not support the idea of sending ballots who have not requested to people who have not requested them.
That's a different position than what he's
I was
previously
going to say, that's
stated.
not mail-in vote. But real quickly, Mark, because we're running out of time, unfortunately, here. We could just go on forever here. Do you think Arizona voters want their chief elections officer at a riot at the U.S. Capitol to overturn an election? Is that what you think Arizona residents, citizens, voters want?
The last time I checked, to be at a place when something's happening is not illegal. I've been treated as a witness, not as a suspect. The mere fact, nobody's talking about Isela Blanc, who was actually arrested on the steps of the state capitol for interfering with operations. Nobody talks about that. In fact, nobody's even brought up the fact that I'm a lifelong member of the National FOP, an establishing member of the Constitutional Sheriffs and Police Officers Association. The fact that I was in Washington, D.C.
For that event?
No, not for that event.
So what were you in Washington for?
I've told you. In fact, you even acknowledged it earlier. I was there to develop or to deliver an evidence book to two congressional members of my constitutionally elected congressional caucus, so that they had the information that they needed to have in the well of the Senate when they went to argue for a question in controversy.
One of the roles of the Secretary of State's office, beyond elections, is archives. How important do you see the role of holding together the state's archives? And related, what do you think of the feud Trump has with the National Archives?
I'm glad that you've asked that question, because under 52 CFR 20701, we're required to hold election records for 22 months. Everybody seems to think that that is the limit that we hold those records. I would like to see those records held for 10 years, because as we look at institutions like ASU and U of A, I think it would be very helpful for us to look at the elections process. Can we establish whether or not, and sometimes this evidence comes up long after the fact, why are we going to get rid of records that could be useful in helping us build a more secure process?
I'd like to speak to the archive question
yeah.
as well. My family history here in the southwestern desert goes back into the 1690s, and that's because of the great work that's been done by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and their Family History Museum in Mesa. They helped us discover so many of the old baptism records from Hermosillo and some other towns in Sonora. This legacy that we have in Arizona that should be maintained is in jeopardy because of where and how the records are being kept right now. We need to put more resources into those, and we've got to have someone who can appreciate the history and the majesty of Arizona. I have that legacy, having been here as long as I have, and I want to make sure that we not only have that, but also this is the successor to the governorship. And I think we have to pay attention to the temperament and judgment of the folks who we would like to be our Secretary of State.
Gentlemen, we have to stop it right there. Unfortunately, we sure wish we could go on with this, but it's time now for closing statements. And going in reverse order of our opening remarks, we start with Adrian Fontes.
Thank you so much for joining us. Democracy is a decision, and as you've seen tonight, that decision could be no more clear. You can decide between community building, and stability, or conspiracy theories and cantankerousness. It is a choice, a decision really, between votes for everyone who's eligible or violence and attendance at riots. It is a decision between the law as it actually ought to apply and really is, or lies, things that are made up. I'm an Arizona native, proud to have been here all my life. I'm a proud veteran of the United States Marine Corps, honorably discharged, and I'd like to serve again, although perhaps in another uniform. I'm Adrian Fontes, and with your support, I'll be Arizona's next Secretary of State.
And now the closing statement from Mark Finchem.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to both of us as candidates. As you can tell, I am passionate about protecting your suffrage. Quite frankly, it's not a matter of Democrat versus Republican versus independent. This is all about every single individual having the opportunity to compete in the arena of ideas, to have no one with a thumb on the scale of election justice. What we've seen here tonight, and I will remind you, an opportunity for you to see just what is at stake here. I'll remind you one last time, Lori Roberts, writing for the Arizona Republic, said that Fontes is making up election law as he goes along. This won't end well. I agree with that statement. In fact, it's a frightening thought. The guy in charge of elections can do as he pleases as long as there's no prohibition of law. My job as your next Secretary of State is to see to it that everyone follows the law.
That is it for now. I'm Ted Simons. Thank you so much for joining us. You have a great evening.